Imagine a board meeting where a whole continent isn't allowed to vote. That's the UN Security Council, where Africa, despite its massive size and growing importance, has no permanent seat. This isn't just unfair, it's a recipe for global instability. Decisions are made about Africa without Africa having a real say. How can we expect peace and security when a vital voice is constantly ignored? This situation needs to change, and it needs to change now. The world can no longer afford to sideline a continent on the rise. The current structure of the UN Security Council, established after World War II, reflects the power dynamics of that era. The victorious nations claimed permanent seats, giving themselves the power to veto any resolution. This system has remained largely unchanged, even as the world has transformed dramatically. Africa, largely colonized during the war, had no voice in this arrangement. Today, this historical hangover continues to undermine the legitimacy and effectiveness of the UN. The exclusion of Africa from the UN Security Council's inner circle is a glaring omission in global governance. This omission not only disrespects Africa's sovereignty, but also hinders the UN's ability to address pressing global challenges effectively. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with a missing piece. Africa's perspective is crucial for finding solutions to conflicts, promoting development, and tackling climate change. Ignoring this perspective weakens the entire system. It's time to recognize the absurdity of this situation. Africa is home to over 1 billion people, represents a significant portion of the global economy, and plays a vital role in peacekeeping efforts. Yet, it remains marginalized in the very institution tasked with maintaining international peace and security. This is not just about fairness, it's about building a more effective and representative UN. The UN Security Council has 5 permanent members: the United States, China, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom. These nations hold immense power, able to veto any resolution. This creates an imbalance, prioritizing their interests over others. The veto can obstruct progress and maintain the status quo. The P5 were the victors of World War II. Their position reflects the geopolitical realities of that time. The world has changed dramatically since 1945. New powers have emerged, shifting the balance. Yet, the UN Security Council remains frozen in time. The concentration of power raises concerns about fairness. Decisions affecting the world are made by a select few. This lack of inclusivity undermines the UN's legitimacy. The UN should represent all nations, not just a privileged few. Africa is a continent on the rise. Its population is booming, projected to reach 2.5 billion by 2050, representing a quarter of the world's population. Africa's young and dynamic population represents vast potential for economic growth and innovation. Africa is not just about population growth, it's also about economic potential. From technology to agriculture, African innovation is driving economic progress. Africa's cultural influence is also expanding globally. This cultural vibrancy is a testament to Africa's rich heritage. The world needs to recognize Africa's growing importance. Compare Africa's projected population of 2.5 billion by 2050 with the combined population of the P5 nations, which is projected to remain relatively stagnant. This stark contrast highlights the growing demographic imbalance in the UN Security Council. How can a body that claims to represent the world justify giving so much power to nations representing a shrinking portion of the global population? This imbalance undermines the legitimacy and effectiveness of the UN. Africa's economies are expanding, driven by innovation, entrepreneurship, and a young workforce. This economic dynamism makes Africa an increasingly important player in global trade and investment. The cultural influence of Africa is undeniable, enriching the world with its vibrant arts, music, and traditions. The current imbalance of power in the UN Security Council is unsustainable. Reform is essential to ensure that the UN remains relevant. A legacy of exclusion. The UN was founded after World War II, when much of Africa was under colonial rule. Africa has since gained independence and become active in global affairs. Yet, Africa's exclusion from permanent representation remains. This historical baggage undermines the UN's credibility. Reforming the Security Council is essential to rectify this injustice. The UN must adapt to reflect the realities of the 21st century. Section 6. Africa's global footprint. Africa is a vital contributor to global peace and security. African nations actively participate in peacekeeping missions. Africa's economic growth drives global development. African nations are key trading partners, boosting global economic growth. African culture enriches the world, influencing music, art, and fashion. Africa's voice is essential in addressing global challenges. Section 7. A seat at the table. Africa deserves a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. This is not just a matter of fairness, it is a matter of necessity. Africa's inclusion is essential for the UN's effectiveness and legitimacy. A Security Council without Africa is like a world map missing a continent. Africa's perspective is crucial for addressing global challenges. Granting Africa a permanent seat would enhance the UN's legitimacy. Section 8. The veto power question. The question of veto power for a permanent African seat is complex. While some argue that veto power is essential for ensuring Africa's voice is heard, others express concerns about the potential for misuse of this power. A careful consideration of the implications of veto power is necessary. Granting veto power to a permanent African seat could empower Africa to block decisions that are detrimental to its interests. This could provide a crucial safeguard against actions that might perpetuate historical injustices or exacerbate existing inequalities. However, there is also a risk that veto power could be used to obstruct progress on important global issues. This concern highlights the need for clear guidelines and mechanisms to prevent the abuse of veto power. A possible solution could be to grant Africa a collective veto, requiring consensus among African representatives on the Security Council before a veto can be exercised. This approach could mitigate the risks associated with individual veto power while still ensuring that Africa's voice is heard. Section 9. A call for justice. The current structure of the UN Security Council is unjust. It perpetuates historical inequalities. This undermines the credibility of the UN. Reform is imperative. The exclusion of Africa is a stain on the international community. It denies basic fairness and betrays UN principles. The time has come to rectify this historical wrong. Section 10. Towards a more representative UN. Reforming the UN Security Council to include permanent African representation is a complex but achievable goal. It requires political will, diplomatic negotiation, and a commitment to building a more representative and effective UN. The time for action is now. The first step towards reform is to build consensus among UN member states. This requires open dialogue, compromise, and a willingness to overcome resistance from those who benefit from the current system. The African Union has a crucial role to play in advocating for reform. A unified African position is essential to exert pressure on the P5 nations and to garner support from other UN member states. Civil society organizations, academics, and individuals also have a responsibility to raise awareness about the need for reform and to mobilize public opinion in support of a more representative UN Security Council. Section 11. The future of global governance. The future of global governance depends on a more inclusive and representative UN Security Council. A Security Council that reflects the realities of the 21st century is essential for addressing global challenges effectively. and building a more peaceful and prosperous world. The current structure of the Security Council, with its outdated power dynamics and its exclusion of Africa, is unsustainable. It undermines the legitimacy of the UN and hinders its ability to promote peace and security. Reforming the Security Council to include permanent African representation is not just about giving Africa a seat at the table. It is about building a more just, equitable, and effective system of global governance. The time has come to embrace change and build a UN that truly represents all nations and is capable of addressing the challenges of the 21st century. The future of global governance depends on it.